Okay, so this one's a follow-up to the last video, talking about balance and tuning things up. You know, the video where I talked about Elden Ring for half of it. That one. So, one of the things that I, in retrospect, realized about that video, as of recording this, I haven't even posted that video yet, so this is basically just a two-part series. So, one thing I was realizing was I was talking about how, proportionately weak power stancing axes are, just like how weak one option is compared to other options. I didn't really, and I spoke about it in a way that that's a really bad thing and should be improved. And in a vacuum, yeah, it should. You want, if possible, all options to be more or less equally powerful in different ways. Different blends of, quote, speed, power, range, all those properties. You want different blends of them, but they should more or less equal out to the same rough area. But, one, I didn't speak about indefensible properties, which I'm probably not going to talk about here. That's a whole separate topic and requires a whole bunch of fighting game analogies, so I'm not going to get into that right now. But it doesn't speak to, sometimes there are just weak options and they're okay. Like, that's not that big a deal. Just because something is weaker doesn't mean it has to be touched up. Because, yeah, maybe it's weaker, but maybe it's completely resourceless. Maybe it's just something you can do for free. Maybe it does take a resource and it seems kind of underpowered, but it's a completely separate resource on its own, and it doesn't conflict with anything else, and it doesn't really get in the way of anything else you're doing. And then, in that case, sometimes a weak option is okay, because it's just more gravy on top of what your character can already do. And something like this is, like I talked about in that video, the Fizzband version of the Dragonborn. I'm going to call them the Fizzband variants. Dragonborn. Their breath weapons, technically, on the weaker side, like, they're not amazing. But they're, like, they don't do a huge amount of damage. And they actually, for a lot of, like, fighters and barbarians and whatever, that get extra attack and molt and the ability to, like, use one breath weapon and a melee attack and stuff. So you might see them a little more on martial characters anyway. But for characters like that, usually a breath weapon is going to do a little less damage than their weapon attacks in general, even if the breath weapon is hitting, like, more like two targets sometimes, depending on their weapons and loadouts and their exact build and whatever. But like that Dragonborn I'm playing now, Raskris, his weapon attacks, like if he's just using his sword, do an average of like, what, I think like about 10 damage average. It's okay damage. His breath weapon does an average of about 10 damage. And it's a different damage type and it's okay, but because it's 2 die, and with no flat modifier, it like, at least in my case, it tends to roll lower. It skews slightly lower, but that's anecdotal evidence. It's fine, especially if you can hit more than one target with it. It's got extra range, and it's got some you can get creative with that type of thing. It's not super powerful, but it is an extra option. And sometimes you don't need to tune up a weak option, because if you tune it up and make it stronger, you're not adding a whole lot to the game. And like our one game, the Erlmeyer campaign, is kind of like this. We don't need a huge amount of extra power on all of our characters, because the DM isn't like super combat focused. And they're not, if we get extra power boosts, they're not necessarily going to match those power boosts in the enemies exactly, so it's not super important that we do crazy damage, and there aren't like tons of combats per day. So we don't need to be extremely powerful. It's just not. It's not that type of game. So, any weak options, they're okay. They're not that bad. And then sometimes maybe you don't. Even if you have determined that an option is weak, sometimes most players are just going to avoid it. Like in 5e, any table that's more optimization focused is let's see what this card is doing. Yep, card's coming that way. Any table that's more optimization focused, they're going to avoid 2-weapon fighting. They're just going to avoid it. It doesn't give you anything. So they're just going to avoid that. And it's, some players, maybe it's they really want to use it, but they just kind of it's weak. I don't need to use that. And, game's okay without it. You don't need to tune it up. But if you do have players that really like the idea, then you can tune it up. And that's the thing. Weak options should only really be tuned up if there's a player that wants to use it. Barbarians post level 10, where they start to just get, or 10 and up, I think it is. Wherever they get brutal critical. When they start to get brutal critical, levels 10 to 17, basically all the way up till level 20, the capstone, barbarians don't get a whole lot. 1 or 2 subclasses get some cool stuff, like Path of the Zealot gets that I decide that I'm not dead yet ability. They just don't die. They get that ability at level 14, that's super fun. But all the other barbarians, all they really get is brutal critical and then some really weak stuff. And it's kind of whatever. So a lot of the time, barbarian players will multi-class out at that point. And maybe that's okay. That's just kind of what it is. You don't have to stick with barbarian. You don't have to tune it up just because somebody wants to play a barbarian. But if somebody really, or if someone is playing a barbarian, or maybe someone isn't even playing a barbarian yet, they're just considering it. So you tune up those barbarian levels, but then nobody picks it anyway. Well, you just upgraded that thing for no real reason because nobody's using it. So it's more so, if somebody really wants to use this option and it's perceived as weak, then maybe tune it up. Something like, Path of the Berserker Barbarian. Their whole frenzy, exhaustion, bullshit thing. Maybe you change that up. Maybe they can, once per day, they can recover exhaustion on a short rest or something. Or at the end of their rage, they can make a con save to avoid exhaustion or something. Or you just give them an item that helps them mitigate it in some way. A lot of the time, you can give them an item that fixes some problem they have, instead of messing with the class feature directly. But then, let's say you have a player that really wants to take Barbarian all the way to level 20. But they also express that there is some weakness with Brutal Critical. Okay, how about each time you get Brutal Critical, now you just expand the critical range down 1. So it goes from 20 to 19 to 18 to 17. That's dumb strong, but it's cool. That'll work. That's great. I like that. And then they might still be tempted to multi-class into Champion Fighter anyway to get another range down to go. If you can crit on a 16 and up, that's dumb. But, just give them something like that so that pretty simple. Or maybe do something really weird, every time they get brutal critical, when they land a critical, they just can make an additional attack for free or something, which is part of Great Weapon Master, which they might have anyway. So those are the things you have to consider. But sometimes, while I always agree that you should look at weak options and at least consider how to improve them as a designer, because it's design practice. Unless a player likes a particular option that is weak, you probably don't need to touch it. You can mention to your players beforehand, or if you're a player and you bring it up to your DM, but it should be mentioned that, like, hey, if there are options that you guys want to use and they're weak, we can talk about that and try to tune it up so it's a little more effective, it's as effective as it, quote, should be. But those are some thoughts on that. Actually, one more thought I wanted to get down on the Dragonborn variants. Like, it's still a little weak, and something I would consider doing is, especially because in a recent Sage Advice video, the designers were talking about adding new things to do with your hit die, which is a great concept. I love that as a concept. Doing anything with your hit die. If you're a Dragonborn, and then let's say maybe on a short rest you can roll one hit die, and if it's above a 6, then you get a charge of your breath weapon back. And maybe you can only do that an amount of times per day equal to your proficiency bonus. So, if your proficiency bonus is 3, you've got 3 shots of your breath weapon normally, and you can spend 3 hit die up to 3 times to attempt to get another one back. And of course, by using your hit die here, it actually creates a nice little interplay with the classes and does focus the breath weapon a little more towards martials anyway, because the classes that have D10, D12 hit die are going to have a much better chance of rolling a 6 on that die and recharging their breath weapon than like a sorcerer or a wizard that they get a 1 out of 6 instead of a 1 out of 2 with like a D12, like a 6 out of 12. A 6 or higher, you get it back on a D12, that's 6 values. So you got a pretty good chance of getting it back. So, and maybe that's okay. Maybe it is okay if the breath weapon is better for more martial characters, and if you're looking at a more spellcastery type, like a sorcerer, maybe the utility of the breath weapon is that it's just another spell-like effect, but it doesn't use a spell slot. It uses a different resource. So it's not cutting into your class's main resource, and you just have another option to use. Yeah, I guess that's about it for this one. Yeah, sometimes weak options don't need to be tuned up, and sometimes there are implications on certain design choices, like, say, that example of hit die for Dragonborn breath weapon recharges. That's it. See you.